This is Amend and Progress, your go-to podcast from Vidori for all things promotional material review. Get ready for actionable insights, valuable perspectives, and best practices to elevate your workflow and team morale.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Amend and Progress, Vidori's podcast about the material review process. I'm your host, Annalise, and today we're going to be talking about how to turn conversations into content to help life science brands engage customers, employees, and thought leaders. Joining me in the conversation today is Chris Connor, host and founder of Life Science Marketing Radio. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you here, both because I'm excited to tap into, this is a topic or area of focus where you've got expertise, but also an immense amount of passion, which I think will make for an amazing conversation today. So delighted to pick your brain today. But as I gave you a preview of, I'm going to ask you some getting to know you questions at the top of the hour, get to know you a bit better, and certainly our listeners get to know you a bit better. Are you up for it?
Yes, let's go.
All right. My first question, which is actually new, but I think what greater common denominator for human beings than food? I'm curious, what's your signature dish or recipe? What's the Chris Connor classic?
I don't know if I'll take credit for this, but it's my signature dish, which is partly aspirational. It's the one, if you ask me, like, what do you really want to make if people come over, is it's Italian style shrimp and grits.
Okay.
So it's in a tomatoey sort of thing with, onions and cherry tomatoes, but also like a spicy Cajun sausage in there.
That sounds delightful. Is there are you like tinkering with this over time, or do you, is there like one recipe you follow to do this? Like, what's your method?
It's pretty much one recipe I follow. I haven't made it a lot, but it's always the one I'm thinking, if we had time or a reason that, to feed a bunch of people, this is the thing I would want to make. To have people go, wow, that's the thing.
Delightful. Well, if you're open to it, send me the link and we can put it in the show notes. And if folks want to make some
looked
Italians...
it up right before we got here.
Okay. You knew what I was going to ask you about. That's fantastic. Okay, excited. I'm going to try it for sure. That sounds delightful. Okay, final question, second question. What is one productivity hack or best practice you use in your daily life?
Yeah, so the things that help me with my productivity that I cannot live without are Calendly for scheduling all my meetings, and then, of course, automatic reminders for both of us. Notion for taking notes when I pre-interview people. Everything I do goes into Notion, and then Descript is what I use for editing all my content. But the Calendly and Notion sort of take care of everything, so I almost never have to think. I meet somebody, I send them a link, they schedule, we do a thing, I take notes, we show up to record. Just
bada bing, bada boom.
It's sort of my manager. Like, I know they say you shouldn't be managed by your email, but Calendly and Notion are staying on top of me.
I love to hear it. I'm a Notion nerd myself. I love it. So many possibilities with it. So glad to hear. I mean, it sounds like you're basically using automation in one of the greatest ways possible, which is to take work off of you, right? So there's nothing wrong with that.
Right. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, thanks for entertaining those questions. I like to get to know my guests a little bit better, and I know the audience does as well. So thanks for being open to those. Excited to get into the conversation today. Like I said, I think you have this unique passion and expertise, Venn diagram to bring to the table today. But let's just start with some introductions. Could you just sort of talk the audience through, who you are and a bit about what you do as a background for the conversation today?
Yeah, so the core of what I do is I help life science companies tell their stories through thought leadership and other long-form content. That's what I love to do, and it's all interview-based like we're doing here just because I think that's valuable, and honestly, it's the easiest thing for me, and I believe it's also the easiest thing for them to have those conversations and then do whatever you're going to do with it. So that's what I do. My background is probably roughly 20 years in science at the bench. Then I took a break for about 7 years doing other things outside of science. And then I got a job doing marketing for Varian, which they sold when they existed, mass spec, NMR, chromatography. They were bought by Agilent. I went there for a year, and then I got a job at Thermo, went there for a while. And I've been out on my own for the last 12 years. So
wow. Excellent. And like what prompted you, past 12 years have been taking this on your own, doing your own perspective on thought leadership content for life science brands. Why do you think this is important? Obviously you feel strongly enough about it to spend the last 12 years doing it. I'm just like curious where this focus comes from, or is there something about your experience or background that motivated you to like focus your time and effort in these ways?
Yeah, it's been a bit of an evolution. So when I first went out on my own, it was really just helping companies, sometimes with just writing or editing and looking over content, which was a lot of what I did at Variant and so on. And then I started listening to a lot of podcasts to help learn about marketing my own business. And I thought pretty soon, if I don't do this, someone else is going to, right? So I thought, all right. And actually, that was a bit of an evolution as well. I recorded an interview with a friend. We were putting on a content marketing workshop, and he's a videographer, so we filmed a little video of the two of us standing together promoting the workshop. And I thought, I had a blog at the time, and I thought, why don't I interview you about using video for content marketing? And I put that on my blog. And I realized after a while that blogging it's hard to come up as a solo person with an idea every other week, write it, get it out. And I felt like I was lecturing people. So I thought, well, I know a lot of smart marketers. Why don't I just ask them, and we'll keep putting recordings up. And pretty soon it evolved into a full-on podcast. So that's how that got started. And then, help companies start podcasts. I've hosted podcasts for companies. I still do, but it's sort of evolved into other opportunities for individuals to do their thought leadership, through interviews. I realize it doesn't have to be, an infinite series. I'm at episode 208. And if you're a company looking at that, you're going, are you kidding me? Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's just have a conversation and use it. And then if that goes well, let's have another one.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, and definitely I think, is in alignment with some of the things that you and I have chatted about in the past, just in terms of the value of the interview and how that just like candor and natural conversation is some of the best stuff you can create. So when it comes to life science brands and those that you're working with, how do you pitch the value of an interview conversation to them as it relates to maybe their broader content marketing goals or their broader brand goals? I imagine there's some conversation on the bigger goal and objective from like a brand or thought leadership perspective. How do you talk about like the value of these sort of maybe audio conversations or short form conversations and how that ties into the bigger story or the bigger goal?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, there's often a lack of content at the top of the funnel. And so what can we put in there? And I think there's value, as you mentioned, the candor and the naturalness of a conversation adds a humanizing element to your marketing. And it's also a differentiator because a lot of people aren't doing it. A lot of companies won't do it. There's that. I think learning is essential. That's really what attracts people. People want to learn, especially in life sciences. They're out here trying to learn something, whether it's physicians learning about a disease state or scientists learning about different technologies, or people wanting your point of view on bigger problems, sustainability, climate, healthcare, whatever it is, right? I have a whole list of topics that you could do as a bigger thing. And then the last one that I'm starting to dig into a little bit is the second guest of my podcast was a VP of marketing when I was at Variant. And she said, you can actually change a company through marketing communications. So I'm digging into this idea of not only reflecting culture, but driving the culture through the kinds of content you produce.
Yeah, absolutely. And so let's say a brand comes to you and they're interested in doing this and you record a conversation or, engage them in doing some audio or video content. How then do you advise them to, because I imagine some of the conversation then is, in the content world and marketing world, it's about how do you make the most out of something you just created? We spent all this time creating this thing. How do we get it out into the world? What's your advice or guidance to brands that maybe haven't done a lot of this before or are new to the audio content world? Like, how do you go from we did this thing, we had this great conversation, to now let's get it out into the world through various channels or tactics? What are your recommendations?
What I typically do is, I mean, I would deliver the whole conversation like we're doing here, but really what I find useful is to break out all the questions and answers into individual clips to use on social media and push those hard. I mean, I probably could push even my own content harder in that way, but you've got to get it in front of people. The one thing about content that everybody needs to remember is that just because you put it out once doesn't mean everybody's seen it, right? Almost no one has. And even if somebody saw it once before, it's not going to annoy them to see it again.
Yep.
There's that. So you put it out in little clips, but then you can repurpose it into, written articles. So I'm sure you've talked about repurposing on here before, but that's a big one. Those are my two big ones. And then the individual clips, sometimes it's you and me, back and forth. I often think, though, no one needs to watch me nod my head while my expert's giving an answer. So I'll just, do a clip of them. And usually you can tell what they're talking about anyway, right? You don't need to hear the question. So, but I would say make the most of it. It's just the simplest way to create content and avoid the tyranny of the blank screen, right?
Well, and it's such a high value piece. And so to your point, you want to make sure you're repurposing it to the fullest extent possible. And I completely agree with you. And I think it's a dilemma we often face as marketers, is like, well, I did, 10 social posts about it. Surely, like, I'm bored of it at this point, or I feel like I've exhausted it. And so that's the end all be all. But no, that's not the case at all. Continue to leverage that over the course of months or years to make sure you're making the most, or getting the most return out of that, investment of content.
Yep.
I imagine some folks that come to you and maybe they haven't done podcasting before, audio content before, and they're a bit hesitant, maybe is the word, or curious, maybe is another word. And there's a bit of inertia to get started. Like maybe they get it and they understand why they should be sort of engaging in this thought leadership content, but they're struggling to get started. What do you say? How do you convince them that this is like time worth spent?
I would say understand that the risk is low for many reasons. One, you don't have to publish anything you record, right?
Yep.
And here's what might motivate some people. Like, when I do podcasts for clients, the best thing about that is in terms of editing, you can only take things out. So there's no one on your team who's making suggestions like, oh, why don't we say this? Because it wasn't ever said. You can do that on the next one, but it makes the editing process simple. You're not bound by anything you say. So I follow this email newsletter by a guy named Liam Curley, and he recently said something about you can develop your thought leadership in public. I know this is hard for companies to grasp, because if we say one thing and then our thoughts evolve, then what are we going to look like, right? I also have a writing coach. I'll give a shout out to Brian Morgan, who's been on my podcast. You can check that one out. But he would say people aren't really concerned so much about your conclusions as they are about your thinking. They want to know how you think, and that's what is attractive to people. And I think, as we mentioned, people just like learning, right? I watched a podcast yesterday on YouTube, and it's just interesting to watch two people they were artists, abstract artists, painting together and having a conversation about their careers. It's just interesting. Like I find myself watching things to learn how other people do things. That's what's interesting about it. I'm not a huge fan of either of their art, but I'm interested in how they think about it.
That sounds super interesting. I would definitely love to check that out. Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think it just sort of underscores this concept of like the interview doesn't have to take one form, right? It could be creative. You can do things in different ways. And so I think there's a lot of, oftentimes maybe we think about audio content in one way, but there's actually a lot of creative liberties you can take with it, or formats or approaches that maybe people can get excited about, or can set you apart from others in the space that are doing audio content. On that sort of lens, you touched this a little bit at the beginning of, your podcast is interview based, of course. Why did you decide to do an interview? What for you, like, what's the secret sauce of the interview? Why do an interview over like other types of formats or different types of audio content? From your perspective, what's the benefit there?
Well, the interview is the simplest format, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that. And I was looking for expertise from other people, right? So that's why I chose the interview format. Now, I
Mm-hmm.
have done other podcasts, some not related to science at all, and some for clients, where I would interview a number of people, but I would take snippets from each of those and put them together, like you might hear it in pat myself on the back to say NPR story, but
Sure.
that you're kind of doing a narrative story with input from a number of people. So typically those would be someone from the company, someone who is a customer of the company, and then maybe a third party sort of neutral person on the topic. And then that kind of weaves together into something that makes sense about bigger topics. So we did, I think I'll say it, I did it for Merck KGaA. We did a season on sustainability, and then we did a season on access to education,
Yeah.
science
Really
education
cool.
specifically. Yeah.
Very cool. And like everyone's into audio content right now. It's sort of like the trendy thing. Do you think it has lasting power?
I do. Until people stop commuting or doing the dishes or mowing their lawn, I hope it does. It continues to grow, which is one, good, and two, sort of amazing. And I think there is a level of engagement that happens with audio that doesn't happen with other things. And maybe that's why people continue to seek out audio content.
You can learn, to your point, doing whatever it is you might be doing. We're sort of like multitasking, which us as humans love to do anyway, right? But I think to your point, we'll never stop doing things in which we create times and formats to learn through audio content. So that's really interesting. I agree with you there. Okay. Final sort of set of questioning here is, and we've kind of like skirted around this and touched on it a little bit, but let's say there's a brand that's just interested in this. They want to start, but they don't know where to start. They want to start but don't know where to start. What would be like a couple good first steps for companies to think about or take action around to sort of propel them into this audio content space?
I would say I'm hoping somebody at the company has a bit of a unique point of view, right? Something to talk about, or an interest in one of those broader topics that I mentioned.
Yeah.
What could we talk about that we think our potential customers, our audience would be interested in hearing about? And then just start simple and start small. There's probably, if you have a company of any size, there's somebody in there who's either a good storyteller or very curious, or honestly could be, a bit of a techno geek and say, I like recording things, or I'm good at this, or I can figure this out. And then just test it out. Test out. Let's do some recordings and see how they sound. Again, you don't have to release them. Release them internally. Get feedback. Maybe people say, oh, I really like that. The person being interviewed is, first of all, they're going to hear it and say, I hate the sound of my voice, right?
Sure.
There's no one who doesn't hate the sound of their voice in a recording. But you have to recognize that that's what everybody's hearing every day, and you've managed to have a million conversations in your life.
Totally.
But other people are going to listen to it and say, you should talk more about that, because I think the experts, as always, don't recognize what they know. They devalue their expertise in some ways, because no one's ever said, oh, I want to hear more about that.
Yeah.
And so I think it just start simple, test it out, put up a file. I would take those, do the video like this, take those clips, put them up and see what kind of response you get, see who's interested, and then create more of that and build from there.
And on you go. You're on your way to being an expert podcaster like yourself. Well, Chris, thank you so much for the conversation today. I genuinely just enjoyed our conversation, your perspective, and just thanks so much for taking the time to come on. We really appreciate it.
That was my pleasure. I appreciate it as well.
Wonderful. And folks, the conversation doesn't stop here. Follow Vidori on LinkedIn for updates on new episodes. Ask us questions. We'd love to get your feedback or any ideas you have on topics to cover on future Amend and Progress episodes. You can subscribe to Amend and Progress on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, this is Annalise signing off for Amend and Progress. Have a fantastic day.